Welcome to the program. In this episode, we step out of our actual reality and step into virtual reality. And we do that with our guest, Sophie Thompson. Sophie is the CEO and co-founder of the award-winning technology company VirtualSpeech, a virtual reality speech technology organization company that uses virtual reality and artificial intelligence to improve communication skills in public speaking, sales, and leadership. In just a few moments, I will let Sophie speak to you in better detail than I can and in more accurate representation than I can about the specifics of her product and her company. But what you should know is that we will be talking with Sophie about a number of topics related to her technology and to virtual reality and AI in general. We'll look at the benefits and risks of VR training and generative AI. We'll look at how today's businesses can use this virtual avatar environment to test responses to situations with real personalities and to see how those match up. And hopefully you'll get a better sense of how this sort of training tool is used in the workplace today, how it may be used in a company like yours if you're leading one, and how you yourself may benefit from a solution like this. But beyond that, we're going to talk about the bigger, broader issues of implementing generative AI tools in a safe and ethical way. We will also talk about entrepreneurship. Sophie is, after all, the CEO and co-founder of this company, took a great idea and one that she really created to solve some challenges that she was having herself, but she had to find a way to commercialize it, find a way to make money with it so that this could be a viable business. And I think her path to doing that will be interesting to all of you. So without any further delay, I present to you my 1-hour conversation with Sophie Thompson. Welcome to the program, Sophie Thompson. So let's talk about VirtualSpeech. I gave a little bit of an introduction, but nobody can speak about a company like the founder and the leader of that. So tell me about the company and what you're seeking to solve.
Thanks very much, Brian. Pleasure to be here. So, VirtualSpeech is an award-winning education platform that helps people to improve their communication skills through active learning online and in virtual reality. An exciting thing that we added in at the start of this year is the integration of generative AI as well. So now people can have free-flowing role-play conversations on demand directly at the point of need. So that's a big addition recently and a really cool feature. We started back in the end of 2015. And since then, we've developed a catalogue of about 30 courses that are focused on skills like public speaking, job interview preparation, networking, leadership, difficult conversations, those kinds of topics. And since then, we have also helped 400,000 people to improve both their confidence and their competence in those skills. And we've worked with about 150 universities and enterprises such as Deutsche Telekom or T-Mobile, Vodafone and PwC. So we've had a pretty wide reach over the last 8 years. And some of those key results, I would say the one that always stands out for me is that we worked with a German conglomerate, and their results found that their employees improved their skills by 25% in just 10 minutes, which is unrivaled when it comes to more traditional forms of learning.
So talk a little bit about what inspired you to create VirtualSpeech. Obviously, this is a unique solution to a problem that every company around the world has, which is trying to help its people get more comfortable in personal interactive settings. Was this a challenge that you faced that you needed to find a solution for?
Yes, definitely. So we actually started VirtualSpeech more of an accident, which may not be your regular story for entrepreneurship or starting your own business. But I was at university and I had a presentation coming up in 3 months. And at that point in my life, I had severe social anxiety. So I wouldn't order my own food in a restaurant. I would hide upstairs from people I'd known for like 20 years because I just didn't know what to say to them. And at its worst, I wouldn't leave the house because I didn't want people to even see me. And so you can imagine my absolute terror when I knew I had a presentation coming up in 3 months that there was no getting out of. And I was talking to my friend Dom Barnard, who's now my business partner, and he was working with virtual reality at Jaguar Land Rover. And really, it was his idea that virtual reality could provide a psychologically safe place to practice a skill like public speaking, which obviously you need to practice at to A, become good, but B, become confident in your skill as well. So really, we started it for ourselves. And then within 6 months, we had 100,000 downloads on the app stores. And I mean, most people, and certainly most people listening, will know or heard of virtual reality now. But back in 2015, 2016, 100,000 downloads was a significant percentage of VR users. And that's really when we thought maybe we should make a go of this, that if this is helpful for other people as well as us. So that's how we started.
Well, it's fascinating. Do you have any data on how many people around the world struggle with this, social anxiety or public speaking? I imagine it's a huge figure, but I'm curious if there's any hard data or even estimates that you have around your potential user base.
So it's thought that, I mean, there's various reports, but it's roughly thought that 78% of the population have a fear of public speaking, which is a higher percentage of people than who fear death. So if
That
you
says a
think
lot,
of,
doesn't it?
yeah, if you think of a funeral, most people would rather be in the coffin than doing the eulogy. So that goes to show the extent of fear that people have. In terms of social anxiety, I mean, I don't have the hard stats in terms of percentages or number of people around the world, but I can say that, and this is factual, but also what we have learned, is that the rates of social anxiety have been increasing over the last few years. And we have particularly seen since the pandemic, when people are very used to giving presentations or having job interviews or just communicating in general over video call rather than in person. And so then, excuse me, going back into an office or back to university and having to speak when people are actually there and actually watching you, or even just standing up in front of an audience, because we're all used to sitting down and communicating now, it has become a bigger challenge for people over the last 3 or 4 years since pre-pandemic. So, yeah, I think any way we can use technology to help that is a good thing.
So as you think about let's talk about the virtual reality element of it first, because I think there's a little bit of skepticism among those who have never used it before about how realistic it is. Give us a sense of how your technology and maybe virtual reality in general, how has it evolved to the point that it is feeling more like you're in the room with the avatar, let's say, or do you acknowledge that there might still be some element of that you can't replicate human to human, but there's critical parts of the interaction that the virtual reality does well and helps you and helps train you to interact in those conversations?
Yeah, so the biggest thing in terms of making virtual reality effective for education and training skills is around that emotional response to the content. So if you've never tried virtual reality, it's probably quite difficult to comprehend. But if you have, or you know someone who has, you'll know that when you put on the headset, even though logically you know you're not in that environment, there is something that makes you think that you are. So, I mean, the best example, and probably the most widespread example, is something called Ritchie's plank, where lots of people at conferences have done this, where you put a plank of wood along the floor, and you put somebody in a headset, and it simulates them like walking towards the edge of a building. Now, obviously, in real life, they are perfectly safe. They're on a conference room hall with just like a plank of wood that's like 3 inches thick. But you put people in VR and they won't walk off the plank, even though they know that they're perfectly safe logically, because their environment around them is simulating something else. It evokes that emotional response of fear and this isn't safe and I can't do that. So when it comes to skills like public speaking, you can immerse yourself in front of audiences of say 500 people. And logically, you're in your office or you're at home and you're on your own probably. But having that feeling of all eyes looking at you or having to speak out loud and stand up, all of those things are still feeling very real to you. So in that respect, something like virtual reality can be used as a form of exposure therapy. So you could build yourself up to speaking in front of even just one-on-one conversations, or go to 5, 10, 200, 1,000 people as you see fit and as you see comfortable. But the crucial thing is it's in a controlled environment. So even if you feel scared, because it's in a controlled environment, it's not that uncontrollable level of fear, because you can just turn the notch down effectively.
Now, is there a difference in the effectiveness of a tool like this for simulating arena size audiences versus conference room size audiences? Because they're very different environments. And instinctively, I would think that it's very good at replicating the big theater size where the faces may actually be hard to make out, but you have to get used to being in the huge environment. But in a conference room setting where it may be you and 8 people and you can see the faces and the reactions more real time, you're exposed to both environments through this tool. But do you feel like it's actually it's easier for one of those settings versus the other to replicate it in VR?
So, kind of the opposite of maybe what you'd expect. It's actually easier to replicate an audience of, say, 500 compared to 5,000. And that's partly to do with the limitations in technology. So, things like if you had an audience of 5,000 people, that takes up, if you want like their individual faces, that takes up a ton of memory space in an app. So, it's much more rare to find those kinds of scenarios. So yeah, that to answer your question. But you can do things like make the audiences more interactive to help with that immersion as well. So say if you had a big audience, you could have more 3D sound going around, and then it doesn't really matter the size of the environment, but visually, rather than everything else, including audio, just visually, it's actually easier from a dev perspective for it to be in a smaller environment, and it is ultimately more realistic as well, because it can be hard to get that real sense of depth and distance that you have in arena setting.
Interesting. So let's talk about those smaller settings. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it does. Does it go down to the individual, like a one-on-one kind of experience?
Yes.
So let's talk about that, because this is where I think people perhaps struggle the most of all the elements of social anxiety, because you have to interact one to one at some point. And if you are going to interview for a job, if you're going to be doing functional things in a workplace, in a public setting, and that is often the one that has the most body language involved, right? And facial expressions involved, the little unspoken parts of our interactions. How have you tried to solve for how we experience that in a VR setting, or do you feel like the virtual reality and the avatars in there actually do a decent job of giving the same kind of body language and facial expressions that you would have in a one-on-one conversation like we're having today?
We have features for body language in specifically. So we can give feedback on the user's body language, because obviously communication isn't just about what you say, and actually that's a very small part of the content of what you actually say. It's more about the tone, your body language, and so on. So we give feedback on each of those elements. But in terms of the avatars around you, we have two types of avatars. So one type is photorealistic, and they're pre-filmed, they're on the loop of maybe 30 seconds or a minute, and they'll be doing things like, I don't know, lifting up coffee and chatting to each other, or but they're not interactive, so they won't react to what you say, or they won't put their hand up and ask a question. But the benefit is that they look like real people, because they've been filmed. And then we have a second type of avatar, which is a computer generated avatar. Now, obviously, these don't look as realistic because they're not real, but they are reactive and interactive. So you could be talking about anything in a presentation or having a difficult conversation with someone, and they can adjust their body language, or they can put their hand up and ask you a question during a presentation. And something we're actually developing at the moment, which is very difficult to do, is to react with emotions as well, because emotions are very difficult to recreate, like small frowns, or someone's angry and their nostrils might flare, that kind of thing. So that's something that we're developing at the moment and hopefully releasing soon. So at the moment, ours don't do that, but they will do that shortly. And lots of these things that I'm talking about in terms of the reactivity have been made possible with the developments of AI, being able to understand what people are saying and then react in a more human-like way because of that.
So that's where I wanted to go with the conversation next, was that we are in a whole new world of artificial intelligence and the generative AI tools, some of which have been around, but there have been big advances just within the last year or two. And obviously, you've had a chance to start working some of those into your product. So let's start with, you mentioned a couple of practical applications today. Are there any things that are in the pipeline that you're looking forward to using generative AI to continue to build the virtual speech? You mentioned emotion is a good example of something that's challenging to replicate. Do you and the folks that you're working with feel like that's something that generative AI can help with? Or are there other elements that you're trying to enhance the solution with that perhaps these new technologies will be the key to unlocking?
Wow, yeah, this is a big question. I feel like I could talk about this solidly for the next 2 hours. But so, yeah, something we're working on at the moment is around emotion. So, part of that is engineering prompts so that it can look out for certain keywords and it can understand tone, and then it can react in a certain way. So, if at a company you're practicing like a customer service role play, and the other person is starting to feel angry, instead of it just being a robot saying like, I am not happy with this service, he'll start to frown and his body language will adjust, and that's all possible through AI. Something that we want to work on in the future, which is actually an even bigger task than the showing emotion, is around showing emotion through tone as well. And the crucial part about both of these and where it's AI enabled is that generative AI means that the avatars can react in real time to these things. You don't have to pre-program them, and it's very rigid. It's much more fluid now and flexible because of generative AI. So if you want to use virtual speech to practice for a job interview, you can practice for any role, any industry, any level, and there will be questions that you will be asked. But you won't just be asked random questions. It will be much more realistic now, because the avatar will respond to you as if it was a real interview, and it will reference things you've actually said, or it will at the end give you feedback and say you could have mentioned this instead. So if it's a question like, why have you applied to this role? So previously we could have pre-programmed that in, but we wouldn't have been able to give any feedback on whether that was a good answer or not. The avatar wouldn't be able to respond based on your answer. Whereas now, the avatar can respond based on your answer. So if you say like, oh, I read an article about the company and I thought it was really interesting, then it could say, well, what article did you read and what did you find interesting? But also, crucially, when it comes to learning, is that you can get feedback on that. So the software can now generate a response that says, well, you should have said more than you just read an article. You should have spoken directly about the company's mission and that kind of thing. So as a practice tool and as a learning tool, it's been greatly enhanced since we've been able to integrate generative AI.
And how do you all set up guardrails? Because, of course, one of the big concerns about how generative AI is going to be implemented in companies is how do we avoid any of the negatives that could come with it? Which, when I've talked to others on this topic, both on this program and off the program, a lot of the concern has been about bias. They don't want to create a tool that reinforces some sort of a bias in the interviewing process or in the general society. And yet, you have to account for it because it's the reality of what some people are going to face. So, how do you all think about where the boundaries are, what you're going to allow your generative AI tools to do, and what experiences you're going to allow it to create?
Mm-hmm. So how we use generative AI isn't in terms of content creation, it's in terms of role play conversations. Now, as you say, something like, well, actually any conversation, but something like a job interview where biases might become more apparent, you can program, and we have programmed the AI to, you basically need to think about like the power of the prompt. So you need to think more carefully about the sorts of prompts you're putting in and if there is any bias in the prompts that you're putting in as well. Because ultimately, at the moment, generative AI software has been trained on readily available, publicly available information, which actually does already have those biases in there. So it's up to us when we're prompting to make sure it looks out for certain things or it doesn't. And those are the sorts of like parameters that you can put on to the avatars when we do the prompts in the back end. And another big question is around data, and is somebody's data being shared, and what is available through platforms like OpenAI, Google, and so on are now enterprise packages where what you say to the avatar and like the data effectively that you're giving it is not used to train their publicly available model. So it's very much a closed loop. It's not entirely open source like people were originally worried about. And I think with both of those things, if you think this time last year, I don't think GPT had even like entered our radar, and so much has changed already in the last less than 12 months. And the pace of adoption, but also like iterations on AI is extremely fast. And since it's been publicly released, things like bias and the ethics have been a huge topic that everybody who's developing these things, certainly at places like OpenAI and Google, are taking these things on board because they have to these days. And so I think we will see a rapid acceleration of the ethical concerns we'll have as well and how they're going to counteract them too. But I mean, it's certainly something to be mindful of. And I personally, at the moment, this might change in 3 months for all we know, but at the moment, I wouldn't advocate for using something like generative AI as the sole assessor for something, whether that's assessing graduates in onboarding or assessing someone in a job interview. I think you can use generative AI as a tool for them, but it shouldn't be the decider between who moves to the next stage and who doesn't.
And that's a great point. So you have a unique perspective on how AI is going to be implemented because you are, first of all, the founder of a company. You have to consider how your company is going to use it, not just in your technology, but even how you may use it to build your company in the future. And that's a very interesting point of view that it is a tool. It is not necessarily going to replace human decision making. And in the way that you're applying it for virtual speech in particular, I'm curious if you observe any cultural differences with how different companies in different parts of the world might be using it, and based on their societal norms, if you've had to adapt the tool at all for that. And if so, do you then have to consider how the AI plays into any cultural adaptation that you may need for, let's say, Europe versus Latin America, or customs and traditions in Japan versus the custom and traditions of Australia, those kind of regional and international considerations.
Mm-hmm. So already with the VR content, we had to think about that, especially when it came to things like eye contact and body language. So in, say, the UK and the US, for example, it's very good to have eye contact with your audience, and virtual speech will train people to look at audiences of various different sizes for the appropriate amounts of time and so on, and help them spread their eye contact across the audience. But there are some cultures, particularly in Asia, where it's actually not polite to make the same level of eye contact as, say, I would make. And actually, what we found to be a bigger one is around hand gestures. So something when we were programming feedback on body language, we, for all our other metrics that we measure, whether that's eye contact, use of hesitation words, pace, volume, etc., we give people a score and a percentage, and they know if that's a good score or not such a good score. With body language, we had to alter that slightly because, for example, Italian people use a lot of hand gestures, and that's part of their culture, it's part of their communication. But if we were to say, oh, you've used too many hand gestures, that's not culturally appropriate for where they are by and large communicating. So that was an interesting consideration that we had there. Also, in terms of the content we have, in terms of how people are dressed, hierarchies, genders in the room as well. So there's certain regions where it's just unrealistic to have more women than men in the room, for example, because most of the time in some cultures, or some countries, I should say, that's just very unlikely. We've also had a couple of occasions where, for example, 2 of our courses around business ethics, and that's divided up into quite specific ethical issues, and sexual harassment prevention. And we have come across clients before who want us to remove the sexual harassment prevention module because it's not culturally appropriate, which, coming from somebody who lives in the UK, is not something we'd ever considered. Why isn't that culturally appropriate? But actually, that's just the reality, that there are some countries where there, say, are less women in the workplace, so that it seems strange to them to be offering them that course, or the way that we've done that course is very much, in hindsight, from a Western viewpoint of what we would consider sexual harassment. That actually, if you've been born and raised in a different country, you wouldn't consider that sexual harassment. So those are all things that we've had to bear in mind. There's some things we can change, some things we can't. So when I think the AI comes into it, I think the biggest difference really isn't in use, it's in what regulations the company has on the use of AI. So there's different levels of fear, I should say, from companies regionally or nationally, I should say. And actually that even goes further down into what types of companies they are as well. So financial service companies, for example, we turn off the AI integration because they're not allowed to use it. Their Wi-Fi blocks it, even though it's secure. It's not gone through enough of the rigorous testing that they have to go through when they're dealing with such sensitive information.
Right. And when you have tried to consider all these different nuances, is the AI technology, whether in the tool or just how you may be using it on the side to develop your company, is it helping you to accelerate your learning curve on that? In other words, to help you consider that if you're going to enter a new market, these are some considerations of that market, and the AI can sort of generate for you based on your company. These are things that you should be considering. Are you using it at that level, the research and development level of the product?
We're not at the moment, actually, although that is a great idea. But we aren't at the moment because we developed things like the body language before. But when we're thinking about entering new markets or having boots on the ground in different countries, that's the sort of thing that we could use to almost as a more interactive version of Google, to be like, what are the cultural norms I need to be aware of for business meetings and that kind of thing. I think it's at the moment, the way I use it is more of a concise but more detailed. So more concise in its results, but more detailed in that singular result than something like Google. I know that we have in the past used it for more of our marketing creation, that side of things. I'm trying to think, what have I used it for? I've used it for making sure I've hit key points in a presentation that I'm preparing. So if I'm doing if I'm doing a presentation on something like AI and I wanted to center it on the ethical concerns of AI, I can tell you that bias and data are 2 key ethical concerns. But if I've got to do a presentation for an hour, I need to come up with more than 2 of the most common ones. I need to know what are the other ones, or if I say I had to do that presentation in Germany or Hong Kong? Like, how are those concerns different in those countries?
Now, do you find that there's a difference in the impact or the user friendliness by age? So I'm thinking about the difference between the way, maybe a high school student might use this as they're prepping for college interviews or something of that nature. How maybe somebody in their 20s will interact with it, and then maybe somebody who's being introduced to the technology for the first time, they're midlife or beyond, and they've been through the work environment for a long time. Is there an age, have you found, is there an age difference in how they're able to use the tool, learn from the tool, interact with the tool?
What you might find surprising is that we haven't actually found a big variation in terms of age groups using the tool. So we have people, I mean, high schoolers using it, but we also have people who are 65 plus using virtual speech. People tend to use it for different reasons. So it tends to be more high school or higher education level that will use, say, the job interview practice when it comes to enterprise scale. Whereas we'll also have individuals using that, but they're not going to use their company's license to look for another job. But across the board, the most popular that we have is the public speaking, because that's a problem that affects everyone at any level of their life. You have to be able to communicate with people, whether that's delivering a class presentation when you're 16 to right up to CEO level, where you might be presenting to an arena of people. Like companies like Salesforce hold their Dreamforce event, and their C-suite need to talk to thousands of people at a time. So yeah, that's our most popular. In terms of how people interact with it, that we don't notice a difference with age. It's more in terms of how they would rate themselves in skill. So if somebody, say, is scared of something like public speaking, they won't use as many features as somebody who is a more seasoned public speaker, and they're looking more at those feedback metrics and really refining their skill. So they might focus more on things like how many hesitation words they've said, or their body language, or practicing the Q&A at the end. Whereas if you're typically younger, or if you're scared of it, then you more just want to use it to get used to that emotional response and that feeling of all eyes looking at you. But then we have courses around like sales, difficult conversations, leadership, and yeah, that tends to be people more management level.
When it comes to the term metaverse, which I know we make a distinction between virtual reality and then and we'll use the broadest term of metaverse. We'll use the Mark Zuckerberg definition of what he is trying to create with his company. These are two different things, but I think in some people's minds, they're getting those two things conflated. How do you draw the distinction between what the general nomenclature of metaverse is and what is expected to be done in that sort of arena, and then tools like VirtualSpeech, which have a more contained and pointed virtual reality experience?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And yeah, as you touched upon, there's different definitions and people don't necessarily agree on them. My personal definition would revolve around thinking of the metaverse as the next generation of the internet. So a more 3D interactive internet with more digital elements. Others may disagree with me. And in my opinion, VR is part of this blanket term of metaverse technology. I think one of the reasons that people get confused or can't agree on a definition is because of Facebook renaming themselves to Meta. When that first happened, people would contact us talking about the metaverse, and they meant Meta, and they assumed that because we were working in VR, that was the metaverse, therefore it was Facebook. Like there was a lot of misinformation then. So I wouldn't say that we work in the metaverse, because to me, part of that is more of a digital world. You you put on virtual speech and you enter virtual reality. I wouldn't say you enter the metaverse. I think a crucial element of metaverse technology is being able to interact in real time with other people, with other real people, even if they're represented as avatars. And we do have an area in the app which is multiplayer. So I could put on my headset here, you can put on your headset, and we can meet in the same virtual room. To me, that is more similar to what a metaverse is, but I wouldn't call that a metaverse.
In a more contained environment. So let's talk about that for a moment, because that is an area that we've read a lot about in the just general opinion pieces and technology publications, that there may come a day where you can have a board meeting at a senior level of a large company with people sitting in 5 different continents, but it's going to feel like they're in a conference room because the virtual reality will be that good. Are you confident that that is a realistic expectation of what VR technology can do, that you can literally have a senior level executive meeting with all the security that you would need around that experience, and that a board member on one side of the virtual table and the other could read each other's body language well enough to interact?
The short answer is yes. And there are companies who are already doing things like that. So I know one that's used quite a lot of enterprises called Arthur, but I mean, there are lots of other ones as well. I just know that some of our clients use Arthur. And that's exactly what they do. They have meetings in virtual reality, and the benefit of them when it comes to just the tech is that sense of presence. It's an enhanced version of something like Zoom. I personally don't think the technology is there yet that it is as good as being there in real life. But I do think it's better than Zoom or Teams, because you have that sense of presence and a physical person rather than just a face, a 2D face on a screen. If you
Yeah.
can have a 3D representation of somebody that is tracking their their facial expressions, their hand gestures, that is going to feel more realistic and have a heightened sense of connection with that person. Having said that, I don't know if that will become mainstream. I might not be the best person to ask. It's probably better to ask somebody who works in the meeting space. But my personal opinion is I don't think that will become mainstream. I think what it might be more likely is to have an augmented reality version of that, or something like holograms, where that person is effectively digitally teleported into the room with them, rather than everyone putting their headset on and being kind of closed off. I think it's probably more realistic to think that AR technology or holograms would become that alternative. But I mean, I may be wrong. I'm not an expert in the
Well,
virtual meeting
we
space
want your
area.
opinion, because we're far more educated on the potential than the rest of us who are just looking at this as lay people. So let's talk about the cost of implementation, though. So let's just focus on virtual speech, but I do want you to then talk about whether you feel like where the technology is today and where it's going is truly going to be cost effective for companies of all sizes, or are solutions like this still going to be more the domain of large, very profitable organizations that can make this investment? Small businesses may struggle with it. Give me a sense of where you feel like we are and where we're going on the cost being a prohibitive factor.
Mm-hmm. If I think about virtual speech specifically, we're compatible with headsets like the Quest 2, Quest 3, but at the moment the Quest 2 is $299, which may be a lot for an individual. But if you think of the prices of things like PlayStations and Xboxes, people do buy them. If you think of it from an educational point of view, it's much cheaper than something like a laptop. If you think about it from a corporate point of view, it's much cheaper than a cell phone that you might be given by your company. So the hardware costs have come down tremendously. So back in 2016, we had things like the Oculus Rift that was over $3,000, and actually the upcoming Apple headset is priced around that point as well. But that's a separate topic. Most headsets have come down a lot in price. So now the Quest 2 is, say, 10% of what people were having to pay back in 2016. And like with all technologies and evolutions and revolutions in technology, the longer they're around, the more accessible they become and the more cheaper they become for people as well, because the technologies evolve, the chips that are inside them, everything evolves. So I think the price point will become less of a problem, whether that's because the price point will come down or because the business model for them might change. So if in not the immediate future, but perhaps the short term or medium term future, if somebody is using something like virtual reality or augmented reality in their daily life, then you might pay $20 a month to have that piece of hardware in your life, in the same way you might pay that for your cell phone at the moment, because you use it in your everyday life. So I think the cost is going to become less of a barrier, whether that's because of the actual hardware cost or how we pay for it and how we interact with it. And from a general perspective, from an enterprise perspective, actually, at the moment, our experience is that it is those larger organizations who are using it because they tend to be less risk averse than, say, a small company who's, say, $200 to them is a higher percentage of their revenue than a massive company. So at the moment, it does tend to be those larger organizations. But actually, in my opinion, they do have a benefit over smaller organizations in being able to take that risk. Because if you buy a headset for $300 and that can be used with multiple people across multiple trainings, you're then saving cost on travel, on that room to have an in-person facilitator there, accommodation that you may need to have to pay for people to attend that training. And what I think will become a bigger factor as well is the environmental cost of not having to travel. You don't suddenly need to send 200 people all to one central location, which in say somewhere like the States, you might have to fly everybody to that location. Well, the carbon footprint of that is huge. Whereas if you have something like headsets that are used multiple times, and obviously they will have their own carbon footprint, but if you break it up, it's much less than flying people here, there, and everywhere. So yeah.
Yeah, and when you think about let's imagine we were talking earlier about some technologies like holograms or whatever else. Do you feel like the headset is where we're going to experience VR, or do you feel like, much like we have telepresence rooms in some large companies, or we have spaces set aside for more of that immersive technology experience? Do you think that we as individuals or as companies will literally have to set aside like a room in the house that will be like the virtual reality room where we can move around in the space with the headset? Or do you feel like the technology is really going to be all about just the headset and your ability to be in one space at one time, but feel like you're having a larger experience around you without having to dedicate an entire space to it?
Yeah, I think in the future we won't be dedicating entire spaces to it. So even a couple of years ago with headsets, once you put the headset on, you couldn't see at all around you. And then with the Quest 2, for example, we had black and white pass through, they call it, which means that you can sometimes see the other side, but it's a bit grainy. And now with Quest 3, you have color pass through, which means it's still not completely clear. But say when you're in the home page, you can actually still see what is around you. You're not completely cut off, which is good for multiple reasons. But while the industry is still new, I think that's very good for making people feel less vulnerable inside a headset, because there is that level of vulnerability. If you put something on your face and can't see anything around you, like that can be quite uncomfortable for some people. So yeah, I see it much more being used in a similar way to phones or laptops, where it's just a part of our daily workflow. I see it coming to enterprise use faster if it's outside of gaming, and it will be an easier way to maneuver things around you and have different screens and that kind of thing. But yeah, I don't think it for very long we will have to have what they call a boundary around you, because I think you'll be able to do much more with the headsets in in future years, but that then will increase the cost of developing the hardware and selling the hardware. Just actually one other thing to mention in terms of costs is around the content production of costs as well. So we personally don't do this as a company at VirtualSpeech, but there are some companies that will probably use AI to create environments, which will be cheaper for them to do than develop it themselves. It will have its own drawbacks, but a pro that might come from that is that then the software is more accessible to more people. But something that we have done to make ours more affordable is we have off the shelf content. So we've created it once and now it can be customized with the role plays, but we created it once and then we can sell it at that price point to you. Whereas previously, and most companies, you have to do custom development, which takes a lot of skill, money, resources. And so it is very expensive. Whereas, I mean, an individual can sign up to VirtualSpeech for $45 a month and you have access to all of our courses, all of our practice exercises in VR and online, and you can cancel any time. So that price point is much lower than if you had to customize content yourself.
And so earlier you mentioned one of the current boundaries that you're working through is the emotions, the inability to always get that exactly right. Are there any other boundaries of either the VR or the AI technology today that you, as somebody who's leading this company, you really want to push past those, but the technology isn't quite there yet? Or is emotion the key that you're still working to unlock the full value of this?
So yeah, emotion is one of them. I would say the other one, so it used to be not having the ability for role plays to be free flowing. Well, that's now solved by generative AI, which is one of the reasons we were so excited about it and why we implemented it so quickly. But there are still that's still not perfect. So there's still like a second, maybe 2 second lag between when you have finished talking and when the avatar will reply to you. And that's because at the moment you speak to one of our avatars and then our avatar is turning it into speech to text, and then it's going back to the generative AI, getting an answer, and then it has to do text to speech before it speaks. So it's actually amazing that it's less than 2 seconds, but in real life you don't have that 2 second or 1.5 second gap. You just reply straight away unless you're thinking about something. So that slightly distorts the realism of it. Having said that, I don't think AI or AI conversations have to be perfect. I mean, humans aren't perfect, so I don't think we should expect AI to be perfect either. But there is something which is more referenced in terms of virtual reality around the uncanny valley theory, that as robots appear more human-like, they do become more appealing, but only up to a certain point. And then once you reach that point, which is the supposed uncanny valley, then we start to think that those robots or avatars are a bit strange. We feel a bit uneasy. So actually, the way it stands with theories like that is you don't actually want avatars or robots to look identical to humans and sound identical to humans and interact identical to humans, because that actually makes people feel uneasy where we are today in society.
Fascinating. So it's almost like the more you perfect it, the bigger of a challenge you may have in getting people comfortable with a tool that is more human. What an interesting, what an interesting challenge. Well, as the leader of a company who may face this someday, your tool may get so good that you reach that point. I mean, and you don't have to have a solution for it today, but how are you thinking about that sort of challenge? Is that going to be something that requires more just societal exposure to get people comfortable with it? Or is that something that you just feel like it's going to take a little more experience with the tool to get people past that initial hesitation?
I think that I know that technology advances a lot quicker than human psychology does, which is in a way part of the problems that we have with technologies, because biologically we don't advance at the same rate as technology does. So I think there will be an extent of that for a while to come. Having said that, the the human brain is amazing and very adaptable. So if you speak to somebody who has used VR a lot or works in VR, and you gave them content that's say 7 years old on a headset that's 7 years old, they will probably put that on and think this isn't immersive. It won't feel immersive to them. Whereas if you put that on somebody brand new to VR, they'll think something different because the person who's used it before has adapted to what they now consider to be immersive. So, I mean, I don't think we are near to the uncanny valley problem being a really big problem. But having said that, how quickly technology advances, we might be, but I think society will also advance at the same rate. Not the same rate. I think society will advance so that it's not as big a problem, I should say.
Do you share the concerns of some of the tech leaders who, over the last few months, have come out with concerns about the trajectory of artificial intelligence and what it may do in an unregulated, uncontrolled environment? I mean, you're the founder of a company that is using some of this technology today, so you actually have an informed view on this. What's your thoughts on what you've heard from some of the industry titans, we'll call them?
Yeah, I mean, I completely share their sentiments, and I always compare it to things like social media. So certainly when Facebook first came out, and it was amazing because you could reconnect with people, and I don't think at that point anybody, especially outside of the social media industry, could have predicted how great it was, but also the negative impacts of social media and say how that's affected a lot of people's mental health and so on. And I think it's the same for AI in that it's very easy to think of all the positives and to think of the potential negatives as very abstract. But I just hope that as a society, we're more mindful of how we use AI compared to social media, and we're more aware and sensitive to the fact that the human brain and the human psyche is very vulnerable, and actually society is very vulnerable as well. So I've started listening to a book called the Coming Wave by, I think he's the founder of DeepMind, and it's fascinating. And he basically talks about the unparalleled opportunity of AI, but also the profound effect that will have on the world and on humanity. And that effect could be very positive, but it could also be very negative if you have a few bad actors playing in. Their impact could be more widespread than we've ever seen before. And something he says is this: throughout human history, there have been certain milestones, I guess, that have transformed how we live, whether that's man starting fires or using tools in caveman times to make things. And he's basically saying that the coming of AI is one of those very few milestones in human history that will change how we operate as humankind, and that can be for good and it can be for bad. So yeah, I would definitely recommend that book to anyone who's interested in AI. So I think it gives a lot of opportunity, but there's also potential for detriment as well.
So, in the last few minutes we have left, I'd love to just talk about your trajectory to be the founder, the leader of this large and successful company. You had a great idea. You turned it into a business. I don't necessarily know that when you started this, you knew that you'd be this far along. So, I'd love for you to maybe reflect on your journey to this point, some of the challenges that you faced turning your great idea into a great business, and maybe counsel and advice for others who are listening to this who also have a great idea, but maybe they're stuck in making that transition from just a good idea to a viable business.
Absolutely. So something that I find quite frustrating with, if you like, kind of influencers in the entrepreneurial space is that a lot of them talk about like hustle and side hustle, and it's really cool, and they don't talk enough about the challenges. So in the first couple of years of VirtualSpeech, we didn't know how to monetize it. We were trying different models, which I would recommend, but we weren't making any money. There were only two of us, and it was very lonely. So yeah, the first couple of years, I did feel very lonely. Over the first few years, I struggled on and off with my mental health, which is very normal, I mean, in general, but it's also very normal in the entrepreneurial space as well. And you have that additional guilt because you're like, well, how can I run a company if I can't even get out of bed and have a shower? Like, there's that additional layer onto it. But as with any profession, there's a way through it. So something that I would recommend is getting to monetizing your product as soon as possible. And the best way to do that is to speak to your customers and learn from your customers. So that doesn't have to be a huge net of customers. You can just start off with 10 customers, chat with them for an hour. With monetizing, we at first tried in-app purchases when we were just an app, and we realized that apps have a low perceived value because people are used to getting them for free and effectively trading in their data. So then we had the online platform and that wasn't a subscription at first, that was just individual courses. But then we found that it was much more difficult to get new customers every single month rather than having recurring ones. So even though the price point was much lower and a bit scary for us, actually in the long term that was better for us. But yeah, the final thing would be to try all of these things and to move quick. So if it does fail, like, you fail fast. So you try things, and if it's not working, just stop and try something else, I would say, but keep going ultimately.
Well, certainly appreciate the honesty and the reality of the early years of any venture and the test and learn process. I think, as you said, there's an awful lot of folks who give you all the positive, and they are not honest about the things that you're going to have to overcome along the way. So appreciate that. If folks would like to learn more about you, your company, what is the best place, websites or social media channels for them to do so?
So you can visit virtualspeech.com. You can find out all about our courses there, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn is probably the best place.
Sophie Thompson, thank you for taking the time to join the program.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you.
What a fascinating company. What a fascinating person. I hope you will all follow up with VirtualSpeech. You can learn more about the company on their website, and we've created links for Sophie and her company in the description of this episode. If you liked what you heard today, there are many more episodes just like it. And at this point, we have so many, you can binge the whole thing if you want to. And with the holiday season coming up here in 2023, that might be a good time to do that. But even if you're catching on to our program 6 months, 8 months, a year, 2 years down the road, whatever time of the year it is that you're hearing this program, you can binge our show. But it all begins with subscribing to it. And you can find us on every available podcast platform. The most popular being, Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Odyssey, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts. But we are truly available on every podcast platform out there. Just search Brian J. Matos and you'll find this program. Hit the subscribe button and you'll get the latest episodes delivered straight to your phone, your app, or wherever you consume your podcasts. You can find me on my website, brianjmatos.com, and also on all the major social media channels. You can find me on YouTube. My YouTube channel posts clips from episodes like this. So in case you can't get to the entire show right away, but you still want to hear the latest and greatest from what my guests are saying and talking about, you can get those clips. Just go to YouTube, search Brian J. Matos. You'll find my podcast channel and all of our clips from previous shows as well as this one available. Hit the subscribe button there as well so you can receive the latest and greatest from that channel, from our interviews, and we get those posted as quickly as we can. Coming up next, our next episode is going to feature Sharon Goldman. She is a journalist for VentureBeat covering artificial intelligence as an industry. So we seem to be talking about it in almost every episode at this point, but this is a show about trends, and it is a show about both emerging and established trends. And can you think of one that's going to have a bigger impact on day-to-day life than AI? Well, if you wanted to know the regulatory landscape and who's doing it well and what's happening around the world, who are the major players and what questions should you be asking about it? Well, there's no one like a journalist who's been covering the industry for more than a decade who was kind enough to share her insights with me, and I'll be sharing them with you and this entire audience of curious minds. That is our next episode. So if you've subscribed, you're going to get that as soon as it posts. If you haven't, this is another incentive to get subscribed to the program. We have lots of exciting topics coming up in the weeks to come, so stay tuned to the program. Thank you for taking time to listen again this week. And as always, I invite you and encourage you to stay curious.